hills and dales, the breadth and depth of England's green and pleasant lands, you are bound to stumble at some point or another into the centre of a ring of weathered and ancient stones, some recumbent, some still standing like the teeth of a long-dead dragon that haunted the land. But who built them, and why? These questions have been considered and debated by historians and archaeologists alike since William Stukeley first charted the avenues and structures of Avebury Stone Circle in Wiltshire and brought them back into public consciousness. And yet, were they really erected by Druids marking the position of the planets, or megalithic man tracing the serpentine course of Mother Earth's power lines? Crop circles, an apparently modern phenomenon, may hold the key to understanding these dragons and rings, but to answer these and many other questions, we're going to have to stretch the fabric of reality and look at what really makes the universe tick. In 1921, the rambling enthusiast, photographer and antiquarian Alfred Watkins had, as he put it, a flood of ancestral memory. He was looking at a map of his local Herefordshire when it occurred to him how ancient landmarks and prehistoric places appeared to be in a straight line. After spending some years studying these alignments and photographing them, he wrote about his discoveries in his book, The Old Straight Track, and adopted the name Ley Lines. Ley literally means a woodland clearing or meadow, and comes from the Anglo-Saxon word lair. This has nothing to do with the current understanding of the phrase ley line, and yet maybe Watkins was onto something, because the word ley is etymologically linked to the word leot, meaning fire and light. Combining these meanings gives us an understanding of Watkins' perspective, a cleared space open to the light, like for example a trackway through the woods, with the hills being marked by beacons. More recently, the word ley has become linked with the apparent lines of energy that trace their course across the surface of the planet and are known by the ancients as chi or dragon lines. But how do we find them? And what do they do? The most conventional way of detecting ley lines is through the archaic art of dowsing, but yet again we have blundered into a minefield of misinformation. Most dowsers use rods or pendulums as their stock-in-trade tools, though many ingenious devices have been developed or discovered that do the job as well or better. However, and it is a big however, contrary to a lot of public opinion, the rod or pendulum neither moves of its own accord or is possessed by spirits. It is us who move it. Human beings sense far more information about their surroundings than they actually use. For example, the visible spectrum of light that we day to day acknowledge is a fraction of the entire range of light. and excludes all but a small part of the ultraviolet and infrared spectrum. Our senses still pick up that information, but our brains exclude it as not useful for our survival, and so don't include or process that information. In the same manner, our bodies sense water flow by the electromagnetic and geodetic currents it creates. Indeed, one particular tribe claimed to detect water by smell. However, we block out that information and disregard its importance. Subliminally though, we can still tap into that information and ask our subconscious to indicate those messages by way of minute muscle responses measured by a rod held in tension or a weight held freely between finger and thumb. You can make a pendulum from anything heavy like a ring tied on a length of cotton and try for yourself by asking your subconscious to make minute muscle movements to enable the pendulum to swing in response. With a little practice, you can ask yourself to swing the pendulum in response to questions, presence of water, and even hidden objects. If you were to take a quartz crystal, you might well expect the pendulum to swing in response to its presence or assumed energy. With two crystals, you might well experience an interaction between them, and here comes a second misconception. Are the crystals talking to each other or exchanging energy? Well, yes, and absolutely no. To have a better understanding of the processes involved and what we are observing, we first need to examine the work of the 20th century psychologist and scientist Wilhelm Reich. Using a high-quality microscope for its time, Reich was continuing the research established by H. Charlton Bastian, a contemporary of Louis Pasteur, on decaying food. He noticed that under high magnification he could see luminous blue-green globules being released by the decaying food, and described these as some form of biological ether. He likened this to bions, a form of nanobacteria which appeared to be neither living or non-living, which had been first named and researched by Bastian. Although pleased with his rediscovery of bions, Reich found side effects of the observation occurring. His eyes started to burn, causing a form of conjunctivitis, and his skin began tanning. He tried numerous ways of shielding his experiments to both protect himself and contain the bions, and by 1940 he had found that the best method was to surround the material by an insulated box, using layers of organic and inorganic materials. In the meantime, Reich had decided that the particles he could see through the microscope were actually an unidentified energy or radiation form, which in turn caused the conjunctivitis and tanning. It was only whilst experimenting with a minute source of radiation in the same box that he began to notice strange effects. In his report of 1951, published as the Oranier experiment, Reich noticed that a Geiger counter placed in the box he was now calling an accumulator recorded a constant increase in radiation until it finally jammed. Simultaneously, huge amounts of oppressive-looking storm clouds gathered around the vicinity, whilst a strange electrically charged purple glow could be seen at night, emitting from the surrounding area. Even when the radioactive material was removed from the accumulator, the effects continued to increase, with the laboratory animals dying unexplainedly, scientists and members of staff falling sick and finding themselves in depression, and eventually the surrounding vegetation and trees bending like rubber, blackening and dying. Even stranger were the appearances of unidentifiable animated lights in the sky, which at the time Reich saw as interplanetary craft, but later referred to as air or primordial energy. The energy that Reich had found, firstly in his accumulator, and later in the surrounding environment and sky, he named orgone, and deduced that it was the energetic building block of the universe. Using his colleague Sigmund Freud's psychotherapeutic techniques, he studied the relationship between orgone flow in the human body and physical and psychological illness, and as a result of over 20 years worth of experimentation, he felt able to suggest a number of properties of this energy. He noticed that not only was it present everywhere and in everything, and that it had no measurable inertia or weight, but he also felt that it was the medium in which light moved and electromagnetic and gravitational fields exerted force. He observed that under the right conditions, which turned out to be neither rare nor unusual, matter could be created from the superimposition of tiny streams of organic energy, and more importantly, the presence of consciousness and volition, that is, life itself, would arise. One of the most impacting results in these experiments for us is that this life force energy accumulates between layers. The more layers, the more accumulation, and that this energy has electromagnetic and gravitational components, both of which we are sensitive to. Thinking back for a minute to our pair of crystals showing an apparent interaction, this then is the first part of the answer we're looking for, but again, not the whole picture. We have to bring to bear the work of the 19th century mathematician Maxwell and his equations of electrodynamics. There are 4 versions of Maxwell's equations which are taught as standard to every physicist and engineer up to and indeed beyond higher level degree. They have been accepted as the standard by even Einstein himself and form the basis of his time and space theories. They are, however, a bastardized editorial of an original 20 postulated equations. Calculated by Maxwell on the foundation of his predecessor's work, like Faraday, and seen as too complicated by his peers, he was forced to simplify them and reduce the complexity of the apparently erroneous components. These were then edited by Oliver Heaviside and further symmetrically regauged by Hendrik Lorentz. However, it is these so-called insignificant components that prove to be of most consequence in terms of how we evaluate our physical world, both with and without them. The most important of which is the fact that conventional science, based on the accepted Maxwell equations, measure time as a linear, step-frame element with gravitation and electromagnetism as separate parts operating in an inert time-space vacuum. However, Maxwell originally postulated that time wasn't flat, but curved, and secondly, that space wasn't a vacuum, but rather a mass-free force which operates in this curved time to effectively create force and mass as we understand it, and subsequently matter. To make that easier to understand, let's put it into a slightly different model using a theory developed in the late 6th century BCE by the Greek philosopher and scientist Pythagoras. It is thought that Pythagoras discovered the mathematical laws of the triangle, but evidence of triangular mathematics and its relationship to the circle can be found in the structure of the pyramids in Egypt. These predate him by another 2,000 years and produce important harmonic proportions in their chambers. However, Pythagoras and his students believed that numbers were the ultimate reality. We have all heard the famous René Descartes phrase, "I think, therefore I am." But what does it mean? Every time we look in the mirror, we see a reflection of ourselves. Every time we listen to ourselves speak, we hear ourselves. Every time we touch a part of ourselves, we feel ourselves. We think that we know that we exist because we sense ourselves on all levels. In other words, to know we exist, we have to have a reflection or second point to compare ourselves to. The Pythagorean philosophy takes as a starting point for the universe a single, unique point that needs, or indeed generates, a second reference point to compare itself to. Because the second point is effectively a part of the first, they are linked. So joining these two reference points together, we arrive at a line of singular dimension. But how long is that line? How long is a piece of string? For that line to be measurable, it needs a third reference point to measure itself against. And of course, that third reference point within the same field establishes the length of the line plus a second dimension of width, creating a single planar field. From its own perspective, it has no height or depth until it can be viewed from another reference point, which by its nature creates solid. But again, how big is that solid? We still don't know how large it is until we use another reference point to rotate or mirror it. And it is that fourth reference point we call time, the dimension that the solid moves through. With the awareness of time comes volition and relative movement in space, which, by the way, with the reproduction of units from a parent, the ability to perceive and react to the environment, and the evolution of the unit in the direction of higher development have been cited as the four main qualities that typify living things. This then defines the apparent limit of the human consciousness, as at this stage humankind has no reference point to establish the shape of time itself, and is merely able to see it as a series of snapshots arranged by the brain as best it can in a linear fashion. This leads to a number of thoughts and observations. Referring to the two-dimensional model that we can understand, imagine for a minute a group of beings whose perception leads them to see their world like a flat piece of paper with no apparent height. And imagine a pen lying on that paper representing a three or more dimensional being. How big would it appear to be? The answer is the size of the edge of the pen where it meets the paper. Now, if you stood the pen on its tip, touching the paper, how big would it seem? The size of the tip of the pen on the paper. If you stuck the pen through the paper, how big would it be? The size of the hole it makes going through the paper. And finally, if you held the pen away from the paper, how big would it appear to be? It wouldn't be visible to the two-dimensional beings at all. Our first observation then is that from our three-dimensional human perspective, beings that can operate in four or more dimensions only present the aspect of themselves that interacts in our three-dimensional perspective.
Look into the face of the void. Learn about yourself. Innocent
How many times have you been driving home and before you know it, you're back in no time and have missed most of the journey? Conversely, how many times do you sit in a traffic jam for absolutely hours, moving at 0 miles an hour, tapping your fingers on the dashboard, check the clock, and find only 2 minutes has passed?
Travelers, here we meet.
To offer an explanation, let's go back to our imaginary two-dimensional piece of paper world and imagine two two-dimensional beings, Mike and Phil, in their two-dimensional cars at one side of the piece of paper. Both cars are identical, same construction, size, weight, and engine. Both Mike and Phil start off from one side of the piece of paper and travel in an identically straight line at exactly the same speed and velocity and arrive at the other side of the piece of paper, except Phil gets there first. How can that be? Well, only being able to perceive the two dimensions of width and length, neither Phil nor Mike are aware of height, so neither of them notice that the piece of paper world is not flat, and rather is quite curvy, and for Mike to arrive last, he has actually taken the route that has the most dips and rises. This is a reasonably good model of time. Like a piece of paper or string, it rises and falls, and can indeed be bent back on itself, and forms all kinds of incredibly tortuous shapes. But, from our perspective, we can't see that, and our brains do their best to arrange it linearly.
Secrets, there be one. The universe is open to all. Questions in the mind, answers rooted deep in our hearts.
So, what is the next dimension beyond time, and how can we access it to see time as it truly is, with a beginning, middle, end, and all the curves and bends? To answer that, we need to go back to Maxwell and note firstly that each new dimension is at a right angle rotation to the previous. Secondly, from Pythagoras, the extrapolation of dimensions would appear to be infinite, but most scientists who have studied this seem to agree that there are probably only 11. Thirdly, the next dimensions from time can be loosely grouped together as G, which is the mass-free force that acts on curved time to create matter, or what Reich referred to as orgone. Hence, it can be seen in a simple way that it is this G that is the sixth point that defines time, and therefore relative space and reality as and beyond how we know it. Now we can go back to our two crystals with a new understanding of what is happening, and add some more variables and absolutes to the equations. It would seem from Reich's research that the two crystals are acting with the air between them like layers in an orgone accumulator. That is, they are drawing or creating energy within their own microsystem. This can be compared to what happens with something called a standing wave. All energy displays itself as a waveform with a frequency and length, and the length of a waveform that divides equally between the distance of two objects that acts as reflectors, bounces off one, meets itself coming back, and amplifies itself, thereby continually building up and creating a standing wave. This is how most musical instruments work. For example, in a flute, air is vibrated down a tube, and the holes in the tube are at precisely calculated length, such that they create a standing wave of sound at particular frequencies that represent particular notes. This doesn't just happen with sound, but light, current, magnetism, gravitational attraction, and so forth. In fact, we are being not only presented by a plethora of varying and different types of energy, but also standing waves which amplify that energy, and this is what seems to be happening with the two crystals. All substances act very differently with energy, and we know from the technology used in digital watches and computers that crystal has particular properties that work within these energy forms, and therefore acts upon them to manifest change. We noticed that each new dimension occurred at orthogonal right angles to the previous, and this is exactly what Maxwell observed. That just as, for example, a magnetic field in a wire is at right angles to the current flow, other fields and waveforms exist at concurrent dimensional right angles, all of which are merely an expression of the mass-free force of the universe acting on curved time. What this actually means is that these energies aren't then limited between the two crystals, but that they generate more lines of energy either side of the crystals, which you can discover by using your dowsing rod or pendulum. Now, for a minute, let's imagine a single dimension space with 2 points of singularity in it, like our two crystals. Each of these points is already accumulating and generating energy from the mass-free energetic element of the universe, which is projecting at right angles from its single line, as well as out either end, seeking a new point to join. So what happens next? The points not only parent new points in their own singular dimension, but new points in new dimensions at orthogonal right angles to the single dimension. Now we have an almost infinite matrix of super fine energy points and energy lines that by its nature defines the universe. Exactly what Maxwell observed in his equations. However, each of the superfine energy lines is reacting with others, in some cases amplifying, in others dampening, and in even others the two energy forms combine to create an entirely new one, all the time generating new points at their intersections. What we end up with is a matrix-like superstructure made of an infinite variance of energy types and forms. But what were the original points, and where did they come from?
I hope you'll never forget. Realign the line.
To answer this, we have to look at a relatively new field of science called quantum theory. Quantum theory came out of the scientific drive to discover the smallest unit that was the building block of the universe as we know it. And quarks, these so-called building blocks, were discovered less because they could be seen under any amazing high-powered microscope, and more because of their effect on other things. Two highly interesting points arise out of this research. The first being that quarks seem to act simultaneously like both a wave and a particle, and secondly, that they seem to react to the expectations of the experimenter. So, although the building blocks of the universe are matter, that is material, they are also pure energy, and therefore appear coincidentally, as Maxwell premised over 100 years before, as a direct result of the mass-free energetic component of the universe itself. if we allow ourselves to be limited to thinking of time as linear, then science has wasted a lot of it searching for a big bang and linear point of origin, when in fact the universe and all of creation has simply existed forever. In the beginning was the word sound. In other words, there was energy and therefore matter. And in that respect, God, creation, the multiverse itself is the mass-free universal energy that saw the reflection of itself and saw that it was good. When quarks were first discovered, the various scientists responsible set up different tests to determine their properties, and yet, when they compared their results, they didn't correspond. After much consultation, the only common factor found was the expectation of the person conducting the experiment. This led them to conclude and then prove that quarks, the energetic building blocks of the universe, were reacting to that expectation. This has led people like Michael Talbot and many others to think that the universe is not only a holographic presentation of the energetic universe, that is, that we take in all of the stimuli from our various senses and project it back out to form what we consider as reality, but that we manifest and create our own universe through the act of filtering those stimuli. Additionally, it can not only be seen that the universe is a co-creation of us, and therefore itself, but that it is a living, thinking being with the infinite memories of its various dimensional possibilities stored in its multi-dimensional matrix. This ties in directly to Reich's observation of what he called orgone as a living thinking energy that seems to react to our thoughts and intents. Humans, and indeed all life, are made out of walking the hills and dales, the breadth and depth of England's green and pleasant lands, you are bound to stumble at some point or another into the centre of a ring of weathered and ancient stones, some recumbent, some still standing like the teeth of a long-dead dragon that haunted the land. But who built them, and why? These questions have been considered and debated by historians and archaeologists alike since William Stukeley first charted the avenues and structures of Avebury Stone Circle in Wiltshire and brought them back into public consciousness. Walking the hills and dales, the breadth and depth of England's green and pleasant lands, you are bound to stumble at some point or another into the centre of a ring of weathered and ancient stones, some recumbent, some still standing like the teeth of a long dead dragon that haunted the land. But who built them, and why? These questions have been considered and debated by historians and archaeologists alike since William Stukeley first charted the avenues and structures of Avebury Stone Circle in Wiltshire and brought them back into public consciousness. And yet, were they really erected by Druids marking the position of the planets, or megalithic man tracing the serpentine course of Mother Earth's power lines? Crop circles, an apparently modern phenomenon, may hold the key to understanding these dragons and rings, but to answer these and many other questions, we're going to have to stretch the fabric of reality and look at what really makes the universe tick. In 1921, the rambling enthusiast, photographer and antiquarian Alfred Watkins had, as he put it, a flood of ancestral memory. He was looking at a map of his local Herefordshire when it occurred to him how ancient landmarks and prehistoric places appeared to be in a straight line. After spending some years studying these alignments and photographing them, he wrote about his discoveries in his book, The Old Straight Track, and adopted the name ley lines. Ley literally means a woodland clearing or meadow, and comes from the Anglo-Saxon word lair. This has nothing to do with the current understanding of the phrase ley line, and yet maybe Watkins was onto something, because the word ley is etymologically linked to the word leoth, meaning fire and light. Combining these meanings gives us an understanding of Watkins' perspective, a cleared space open to the light, like for example a trackway through the woods, with the hills being marked by beacons. More recently, the word ley has become linked with the apparent lines of energy that trace their course across the surface of the planet and are known by the ancients as chi or dragon lines. But how do we find them? And what do they do? The most conventional way of detecting ley lines is through the creating new interactions. In the Reichian sense, they accumulate orgone or life energy between themselves, as well as further amplifying that by creating standing waves. These interact with the energetic matrix of the ley lines, creating further electromagnetic gravitational currents at orthogonal right angles, which reach out into space at all levels. Add a few more stones to create a ring, and you not only establish a ring of energy and all its component right angle parts, but also a central vertical core current reaching up and down through the dimensional levels. The stones themselves become a representation of the 3D reality we perceive, much like the Pythagorean dimensional points that define height, breadth, and width, and in themselves act not only to define a sacred or special space within the multidimensional universe, but simultaneously lock it into this reality, as well as act as a multi-dimensional gateway to all other realities. This is why they are often aligned to the stars and moon, and most importantly elements of the solar cycle, because it is precisely these quarter points that would have defined man's reality in relation to his material needs for day-to-day survival. In the Pythagorean model, it is the next node of time that serves to determine how that 3D space interacts within the multidimensional universe. And we find the physical representation not a long way from a stone circle in the form of a king or keystone. According to sacred geometry, measurement in sacred space is very important in how that space is defined according to ancient numerological systems and the association between number and sacred, as well as secular concepts. What I believe is happening here is that the proportional dimensions of the space, defined by its component stone parts, create or amplify particular frequencies. Again, much in the same way that the relative position of holes in a tube creates sound frequencies when the tube is blown that correspond to a musical scale. The king or keystone fulfills a similar role in its interaction with the parent circle in defining how the circle can be used to access multi-dimensional space. Bearing in mind the intent of its creators and how the universe can be modelled on the thoughts and emotions of humans, it is possible to see that if man were so inclined and able to understand these harmonic relationships, they would be able to tune into the energy grid of the planet and choose very carefully those places to build not only stone circles, but other standing stones and other structures that were not only isolated multidimensional gateways, but also had an interaction between each of them, joining them into a massive, world-covered superstructure, like a gigantic intergalactic computer. Many ancient cultures have mythologies that not only tie their place of birth or origin into the stars and particular star systems, but also the place where their spirits go to at death. It is interesting to note that many people entering stone circle or burial mounds notice an elevated sense of consciousness, often tuning into beings from another dimension, such as fairies, pixies, and extraterrestrials, and sometimes even noticing time anomalies. It is much more likely that we are tuning into higher and indeed lower states of living energy and holographically projecting a representation of that energy into our three-dimensional reality. Astral projection, or out-of-body experiences, similarly take us into altered states of reality and consciousness, where a person finds themselves lucidly interacting in another time, place, or reality. This process again is found to be amplified or manifested within stone circles and other similar structures.
Gather all the people, gather all the people.
And now we're back where we started, in the centre of a ring of ancient stones. An interdimensional time capsule built tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years ago. But was it by chance, or by accident, or by design? Are we alone, or is the truth really out there?